Ma'am, you don't belong in first class. Stand up and move to the back of the plane right now. Captain Daniel Harper's voice sliced through the quiet cabin with the confidence of a man who believed he could never be questioned. Every conversation stopped. Crystal glasses froze halfway to waiting hands. The gentle hum of the aircraft suddenly felt distant as dozens of passengers turned towards seat 2A. Sitting there without the slightest sign of panic was Naomi Brooks, a 46-year-old black woman wearing dark blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a simple charcoal sweater. No designer handbag rested beside her. No sparkling jewelry announced her wealth. No assistant stood nearby. She looked like any traveler hoping to make an afternoon flight from Chicago to New York. Daniel folded his arms and stared at her boarding pass without taking it. "You heard me," he said, louder this time, making sure everyone within earshot could hear. "First class is reserved for premium passengers. Economy is through that curtain." A few uncomfortable chuckles floated across the cabin. An older white businessman glanced away, pretending to study his phone. A young couple exchanged uncertain looks. One passenger quietly slipped wireless earbuds from his ears, sensing something far more interesting than the safety announcement was about to unfold. Naomi slowly raised her eyes toward the captain. Calm, steady, almost curious. She had seen that expression before. The tight jaw, the quick judgment, the certainty that appearance revealed value. 23 years earlier, she had walked into a corporate boardroom carrying a leather portfolio instead of an expensive briefcase. A senior executive had mistaken her for administrative staff before she had even introduced herself. She remembered the embarrassment, but more importantly, she remembered the promise she made herself that day. Never let someone else's assumptions dictate your response. Today, that promise remained intact. "My boarding pass is valid," Naomi answered softly. "I selected this seat weeks ago." Daniel barely glanced at the document she offered. "I'm not asking again." His tone carried the weight of authority that usually ended conversations before they began. Behind him, senior flight attendant Linda Cooper stepped closer, studying Naomi from head to toe before leaning toward the captain. "Maybe there's been a mix-up," she whispered, though not quietly enough to avoid being overheard. "She probably boarded through the wrong lane." Naomi heard every word. She simply folded her hands across her lap. Outside the large oval window, the late afternoon sunlight reflected across the airport ramp while baggage crews finished loading the aircraft. Inside, however, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The luxury cabin no longer felt welcoming. It felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. A teenager seated across the aisle quietly reached for his phone before his mother gently lowered his hand. "Just watch," she whispered. "Something doesn't feel right." Daniel took one deliberate step closer. "If you refuse to cooperate, airport security will escort you off this aircraft." Silence settled over the cabin. Even Linda seemed surprised by how quickly the situation had escalated. Naomi looked around the first-class section, meeting the eyes of strangers who had already begun forming opinions without knowing a single thing about her. Then she looked back at Captain Harper. There was no anger in her expression, no fear, only an almost invisible disappointment, as though she had hoped this flight, and this airline, had learned something the rest of the world still struggled to understand. She offered one quiet sentence that barely rose above a whisper, yet somehow carried through the entire cabin. "Captain, the mistake you're making won't delay this flight nearly as much as the consequences that follow." Naomi Brooks did not travel in luxury because she needed anyone to admire her. She traveled that way because she had earned every mile through decades of discipline, impossible decisions, and nights when success felt farther away than the horizon outside an airplane window. Yet on this afternoon, none of that was visible. That had been her decision from the moment she left her apartment before sunrise. She had chosen comfortable clothes instead of tailored business attire. She had left every expensive watch, every recognizable handbag, and every symbol of executive status behind. Even the vehicle that dropped her at the terminal belonged to a standard airport car service instead of the black SUVs that usually followed her schedule. She wanted to experience the airline exactly as an ordinary passenger would. 3 weeks earlier, Apex Aviation Group had finalized the largest investment in the airline's history, making Naomi the chief executive officer of the parent company with direct oversight of customer experience. Reports filled her desk every morning praising service scores, employee professionalism, and premium cabin satisfaction. The numbers looked impressive. The presentations looked polished. But Naomi had built an $8 billion company by trusting reality over reports. She believed the truth rarely lived inside conference rooms. It revealed itself where no executive was expected to appear. That belief had shaped her entire career. At 28 years old, she had visited one of her first hotels without announcing herself, discovering overflowing trash bins and employees ignoring guests until management recognized her face. That single visit transformed how she evaluated every business she later acquired. Success, she often reminded her leadership team, was measured by how strangers were treated, not by how executives were welcomed. As Captain Harper continued standing over her seat, Naomi quietly noticed details that most passengers ignored. Linda Cooper avoided eye contact whenever another passenger looked her way. A flight attendant near the galley seemed uncertain whether to continue boarding beverages or watch the confrontation unfold. Two gate agents outside the aircraft door exchanged confused glances after hearing the raised voices from inside the cabin. Every reaction told a story. Every hesitation became another piece of a much larger picture. Across the aisle sat a young software engineer named Ethan Collins traveling home after a technology conference in Chicago. He had boarded only minutes earlier and clearly recognized that something about the situation felt wrong. He looked from Naomi to Captain Harper, then back. Again, silently comparing the calm dignity of one person against the growing certainty of another. 3 rows behind first class, newly hired flight attendant Emily Carter waited near the forward galley reviewing passenger information on her handheld device. She had noticed the name Naomi Brooks when the boarding list synchronized moments before departure. The system displayed an executive service designation she had only seen during training. Emily frowned, looked again at the screen, then toward the front of the cabin where Captain Harper continued speaking with unmistakable confidence. She hesitated. New employees were taught to respect the chain of command. They were also taught that every passenger deserved equal treatment. Standing there with her tablet still glowing in her hands, she realized those 2 lessons were about to collide. Meanwhile, Naomi remained perfectly still, listening more than speaking. The cabin had become quieter than before boarding began. Even the conversations from the jet bridge had faded into the background. Sometimes silence exposed people more honestly than words ever could, and Naomi had learned long ago that the longer someone revealed their assumptions, the clearer the truth eventually became. Captain Daniel Harper reached for Naomi's boarding pass at last, giving it only the briefest glance before handing it back without allowing the barcode to be scanned. "This does not change anything," he said firmly. "Someone made a mistake at the gate, and I am correcting it before we leave." Naomi accepted the document with the same steady composure she had shown from the beginning. "Captain, if you believe there is an error, perhaps the reservation system should be checked instead of making assumptions about a passenger." Her voice remained respectful, but that calmness seemed only to irritate him further. Linda Cooper stepped forward holding a tablet connected to the airline's passenger manifest. She tapped the screen several times before frowning. "The seat assignment still shows occupied by Naomi Brooks," she admitted quietly. Daniel barely looked at the display. "Refresh it." She did. The result remained unchanged. "It still says the same thing." He shook his head. Then someone entered incorrect information. That seat was intended for another passenger. Across the aisle, Ethan Collins watched the exchange carefully. As a software engineer, he trusted systems more than assumptions. If the reservation software continued confirming the assignment, dismissing it without evidence made little sense. Several nearby passengers appeared to reach the same conclusion. The uneasy silence gradually shifted into whispered conversations. "If her ticket is valid, why is this still happening?" one woman quietly asked her husband. Another passenger leaned into the aisle, trying to catch a glimpse of Naomi's boarding pass. The atmosphere no longer reflected confidence in the captain's judgment. Instead, uncertainty spread from row to row. Near the aircraft door, Emily Carter could no longer ignore what she had seen on her device. She opened the passenger profile again, carefully reviewing every line. The executive service designation remained highlighted beside Naomi's name. Additional notes appeared beneath it indicating that airport management had personally confirmed boarding procedures less than 20 minutes earlier. Emily's heart began beating faster. During training, supervisors had emphasized that executive service profiles required precise handling because they often involved company leadership, major investors, or confidential inspections. She looked toward Captain Harper, wondering whether he had reviewed the same information. From his actions, she doubted he had reviewed any of it. Emily took a cautious step toward Linda. Before she could speak, Daniel noticed the movement. "Stay where you are," he instructed without taking his eyes off Naomi. Emily stopped immediately. She was new enough to understand that openly challenging a captain in front of passengers could jeopardize her career. Yet remaining silent suddenly felt equally difficult. Naomi noticed the hesitation on the young flight attendant's face, but said nothing. She recognized that expression as well. It was the look of someone caught between doing what was easy and doing what was right. Outside the aircraft, the boarding bridge remained attached while the departure clock continued counting down. Gate agents checked their watches as scheduled departure approached. Inside the cabin, every passing second increased the tension. Daniel finally folded his arms again. "I will give you one final opportunity to leave voluntarily before airport operations become involved." Naomi met his gaze with complete calm. "Captain Harper, I have no intention of creating a disruption. I simply intend to remain in the seat that your airline assigned to me." The confidence in her answer puzzled more passengers than any expensive suit ever could. People expecting fear saw patience instead. People expecting excuses heard certainty. Without raising her voice even once, Naomi had quietly shifted the attention of the entire cabin away from what she looked like and toward how she was being treated. Few realized that the balance of power had already begun to change, even though almost no one yet understood why. Emily Carter could no longer convince herself that staying silent was the safest choice. The glowing screen in her hand continued displaying the same information no matter how many times she refreshed it. Naomi Brooks was not listed as a misplaced passenger. She was marked with an internal executive service designation that required special handling, and the notation carried an authorization code Emily had only seen during orientation. She swallowed nervously before taking another careful step toward Linda Cooper. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I think there is something on the passenger profile that Captain Harper should review." Linda glanced toward the tablet, but hesitated. Before she could respond, Daniel turned sharply. "Emily, I gave you an instruction." His voice remained controlled, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "Return to your assigned position." Emily froze for a moment. She respected the captain, yet the training manual echoed in her mind with equal force. Verify facts before making assumptions. Treat every passenger with dignity. Escalate concerns through proper channels when information conflicts with actions. She lowered her voice even further. "Captain, I believe this may be important." Daniel did not even look at her screen. "What is important is departing on time. We are done discussing this." Emily reluctantly stepped back, but the concern remained written across her face. Naomi noticed the exchange without interrupting. She appreciated the young flight attendant's effort, even if it had changed nothing for the moment. Across the aisle, Ethan Collins leaned slightly toward the businessman seated beside him. "Something is off," he whispered. "If the crew has electronic records confirming her seat, why is nobody checking them?" The older man nodded slowly. "I was wondering the same thing." Their conversation was quiet, but it reflected a growing shift throughout the cabin. Passengers who had initially assumed there must be an innocent misunderstanding were beginning to question whether they were witnessing something far more troubling. A woman in the second row spoke gently toward Naomi. "Ma'am, are you traveling alone?" Naomi turned with a polite smile. "Yes, I am. Do you have anyone from the airline who can verify your reservation?" Naomi considered the question for a brief moment before answering. "There are people who can verify it. I simply hoped it would not become necessary." That answer lingered in the air. It was not defensive. It was not emotional. It sounded like someone who already knew exactly how the situation would end, but preferred giving others every opportunity to correct it first. Daniel interpreted her calm confidence differently. To him, it sounded like a bluff. "Enough," he said firmly. "This discussion is over." He looked toward Linda. "Contact the gate supervisor and advise them that we have a passenger refusing crew instructions." Linda hesitated only briefly before reaching for the interphone. Her movements were slower now than they had been earlier, and several passengers noticed. Confidence had quietly given way to uncertainty. Outside the aircraft, a gate supervisor paused after receiving the message and looked through the open boarding door toward the first-class cabin. He could not hear every word, but he immediately recognized the unusual tension inside. Boarding had already finished, yet no one seemed prepared for departure. Inside the cabin, Naomi rested her boarding pass neatly on the armrest and folded her hands once more. Her breathing remained steady. Her expression never changed. Years of leading difficult negotiations had taught her that patience often revealed more than confrontation ever could. The room belonged to whoever remained calm the longest. Emily looked once more at the executive designation on her screen, then quietly memorized the authorization number beneath Naomi's name. If someone higher in the company became involved, she wanted to be absolutely certain she could describe exactly what she had seen. Around her, whispers continued spreading through the cabin, and the mood had transformed completely. What had begun as a simple disagreement over a seat was now becoming a question every passenger silently asked themselves. If the documents were valid, the reservation was confirmed, and the passenger had remained respectful from the beginning, why was no one willing to admit that the real mistake might not be sitting in seat 2A at all? The gate supervisor arrived at the aircraft door within moments, carrying a tablet linked to the airline's operations system. He looked first at Captain Harper, then at Naomi, sensing immediately that this was no ordinary boarding delay. "Captain, operations asked me to verify the situation," he said politely. Daniel answered before anyone else could speak. "Passenger in seat 2 Alpha refuses crew instructions after being assigned to the wrong cabin." The supervisor nodded, then turned toward Naomi. "Ma'am, may I please see your boarding pass?" Naomi handed it over without hesitation. He scanned the barcode. A soft confirmation tone sounded from the device. He frowned slightly and scanned it again. The same confirmation appeared on the screen. Before he could continue reading, Daniel interrupted. "The system is obviously carrying an incorrect assignment. We need to remove the passenger so we can depart." The supervisor hesitated. "Captain, I would like to review the reservation details first." Daniel's patience was visibly wearing thin. "There is nothing to review. I have already made my decision." Those words echoed through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged uneasy looks. Ethan Collins quietly shook his head. In his experience, professionals who refused to verify information usually feared what they might discover. Emily Carter watched silently from the galley, still clutching her tablet. She could see the gate supervisor trying to navigate the passenger profile, but Daniel's insistence prevented him from examining the details carefully. Naomi remained composed, yet her eyes drifted toward the aircraft window for just a moment. The reflection looking back reminded her of another flight many years earlier, when she had been a young financial analyst carrying a single carry-on bag and a notebook full of dreams. A fellow traveler had assumed she was in the wrong boarding lane simply because of the way she looked. She had promised herself that if success ever came, she would never allow bitterness to define her. Instead, she would build organizations where respect came before appearance. That promise had shaped every company she led. Returning her attention to the present, Naomi accepted her boarding pass from the supervisor with a grateful nod. "Thank you for verifying it." Daniel took a slow breath before speaking again. "Verification does not change my judgment. I am responsible for this aircraft, and I am instructing you to leave the cabin." His words were firm, but they no longer carried the unquestioned confidence they had only minutes earlier. Too many people had now witnessed the reservation being confirmed. Too many questions remained unanswered. Linda Cooper looked from Daniel to the gate supervisor, clearly uncertain about the next step. The supervisor finally spoke with careful professionalism. "Captain, operations may want additional clarification before any further action is taken." Daniel answered immediately. "Operations can receive their clarification after departure." Naomi looked directly at him, her expression unchanged. "Captain Harper, I have given everyone here every opportunity to review the facts before reaching a conclusion. I genuinely hoped that would be enough." The cabin fell silent once again. No one interrupted. No one whispered. Even the passengers who had avoided eye contact earlier were now watching every word. Naomi slowly reached into her handbag and removed her phone. She did not raise it dramatically or make a scene. She simply unlocked the screen, selected a single contact that had remained untouched throughout the entire encounter, and pressed the call button. When the line connected, she spoke with the same calm voice she had maintained from the beginning. "Rachel, this is Naomi. Please activate Executive Protocol 7 for Flight 482. I believe it is time." She ended the call less than 15 seconds later and placed the phone back into her bag. Nobody in the cabin understood what Executive Protocol 7 meant, but the quiet certainty behind those words sent an unmistakable feeling through the aircraft. Whatever was about to happen next had already begun, and for the first time since boarding, Captain Harper was no longer the only person in control of the situation. Rachel Morgan answered before the first ring had fully ended. She had worked beside Naomi Brooks for 11 years and recognized immediately that the request was not routine. Executive Protocol 7 had been created for one purpose only. It was never activated because of financial losses, delayed flights, or executive convenience. It existed for moments when the character of an organization was being tested in real time. Rachel spoke only 4 words. "I understand. We are moving." Within seconds, secure notifications reached the airline's Executive Operations Center in New York. A legal advisor paused in the middle of a conference call. The vice president of customer experience stood up from his desk without asking questions. 2 members of the corporate compliance team began reviewing live operational data connected to Flight 482. Every response followed a procedure that had been rehearsed but never expected to happen. Back on the aircraft, nothing appeared different. Captain Harper still believed he controlled the pace of events. He glanced at his watch and sighed impatiently. "We have already lost enough time," he said. "Gate supervisor, please conclude this matter so we can depart." The supervisor looked down at his tablet once more. Before he could answer, the device vibrated with an incoming priority notification. His expression changed as he read the message. It instructed him to delay aircraft departure pending executive review. He looked up, surprised. "Captain, operations has requested that boarding remain suspended for the moment." Daniel frowned. "On whose authority?" The supervisor hesitated. "The message is marked executive priority." Daniel gave a short, skeptical laugh. "Someone at headquarters is overreacting to a customer complaint." Naomi remained silent. She neither confirmed nor denied anything. Across the cabin, Ethan Collins noticed the subtle shift. The conversation was no longer centered on convincing Naomi to leave. It had become centered on waiting for information from people outside the aircraft. The balance had changed. Linda Cooper checked her company phone and discovered several unread messages requesting an immediate status update. She had never seen that level of attention focused on a single passenger. Emily Carter's tablet refreshed automatically, and a bright banner appeared across the top of the screen. Executive review in progress. Preserve all passenger records. Do not modify documentation. Emily quietly inhaled. Her training had mentioned that notification only once. It meant every action taken from that moment forward would become part of an official corporate review. She looked toward Naomi again. The woman in seat 2 Alpha had not raised her voice once. She had not argued, demanded special treatment, or reminded anyone of her accomplishments. She had simply remained patient while everyone else revealed exactly how they made decisions. Outside the aircraft, 2 professionally dressed individuals entered the jet bridge carrying identification badges that neither gate agents nor supervisors questioned. They walked with calm purpose instead of urgency, speaking quietly into wireless headsets as they approached the cabin door. The gate supervisor immediately stepped aside after recognizing the credentials hanging from their jackets. Inside first class, passengers noticed the change before they understood its meaning. Conversations stopped once more. Even Captain Harper straightened his uniform as the visitors came into view. One of them looked briefly across the cabin before asking a simple question that carried unexpected weight. "Is Ms. Naomi Brooks still on board?" No one answered immediately. Every eye turned toward seat 2 Alpha. Naomi slowly looked up with the same composed expression she had worn since the confrontation began. "Yes," she replied gently. "I am right here." The visitors exchanged a brief glance, and the older of the 2 offered a respectful nod before speaking into his headset. "Confirmed. Please proceed with the executive arrival. She is waiting." The words executive arrival settled over the cabin with a weight no one could explain. Captain Daniel Harper looked toward the aircraft door, expecting perhaps a regional supervisor or an airport manager. Instead, 3 more people stepped aboard in dark business attire, each wearing corporate identification badges that immediately caught the attention of every airline employee present. At the front walked Rachel Morgan, Naomi Brooks's executive assistant, followed closely by Michael Grant, the airline's chief legal officer, and Victor Reynolds, chairman of the board for Apex Aviation Group. The moment Rachel entered the cabin, she walked directly past Captain Harper without acknowledging him. Her attention remained fixed on seat 2 Alpha. She stopped beside Naomi and smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks. I apologize for the delay. We came as quickly as possible." Naomi returned the smile with quiet grace. "Thank you, Rachel." The simplicity of the exchange sent a wave of confusion through the cabin. Captain Harper stared at the group in disbelief. Victor Reynolds then stepped forward, extending his hand toward Naomi with genuine respect. "Naomi, I regret that your inspection began this way. The board will address what has happened today immediately." Several passengers exchanged stunned glances. Ethan Collins slowly lowered the phone he had been holding in his lap, realizing he was witnessing something far beyond an ordinary customer dispute. Emily Carter covered her mouth for a brief moment as everything she had suspected suddenly became clear. Michael Grant turned toward the captain with calm professionalism. "Captain Harper, before any further decisions are made, you should know that Ms. Naomi Brooks is the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Aviation Group, the parent company and majority owner of this airline." The words seemed to remove every sound from the cabin. Even the distant noise of baggage vehicles outside faded into the background. Daniel's confident posture disappeared almost instantly. He looked from Michael Grant to Victor Reynolds and finally back to Naomi, searching for some indication that this was a misunderstanding. He found none. Naomi remained seated exactly where she had been since boarding, showing neither satisfaction nor anger. Rachel handed Naomi a slim folder containing documents that required her signature later that afternoon. On the cover was the Apex Aviation Group logo that many employees recognized immediately. Linda Cooper's face lost its remaining color as she looked from the folder to Naomi, replaying every moment of the past 20 minutes in her mind. Victor Reynolds addressed the passengers with a composed voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely apologize for the delay to your journey. Ms. Brooks chose to travel today without advance notice as part of a routine review of our customer experience. She believed the best way to understand our service was to experience it exactly as every passenger does." Several travelers nodded quietly, now understanding why Naomi had dressed so simply and never attempted to reveal her position. Ethan spoke almost under his breath. She never needed to prove who she was. She wanted to see who everyone else would become. Naomi finally stood, smoothing the sleeve of her sweater before turning toward Captain Harper. There was no triumph in her expression, only measured disappointment. "Captain Harper," she said gently, "you believed authority gave you permission to decide where I belonged before you ever decided to learn who I was. The difficult part is not that you failed to recognize your chief executive officer. The difficult part is that you believed another human being deserved less respect simply because of how she appeared." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time that afternoon, certainty had completely abandoned him. Around the first-class cabin, every passenger understood they had just witnessed something far more significant than a delayed departure. They had watched assumptions collide with truth, and truth had arrived without raising its voice. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The silence inside the first-class cabin carried more weight than any announcement could have. Captain Daniel Harper lowered his eyes, no longer looking at Naomi Brooks, but at the polished floor beneath him. Years of experience, thousands of flight hours, and countless successful departures suddenly meant very little compared to the judgment he had made in a matter of seconds. Michael Grant stepped forward with the calm precision of someone accustomed to handling difficult corporate moments. "Captain Harper, under the authority granted by Apex Aviation Group and in coordination with airline operations, your flight status is being temporarily reassigned pending a formal review. This is an administrative action only. Please accompany our operations representative." There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation, only quiet professionalism. Daniel nodded once. He understood that arguing would accomplish nothing. Linda Cooper received a notification on her company device at almost the same moment. Her access screen refreshed automatically, displaying instructions to report to employee services immediately after deplaning for an interview regarding the incident. She looked toward Naomi with visible regret. "Ms. Brooks," she said softly, "I should have verified the facts instead of following assumptions. I am truly sorry." Naomi met her eyes and gave a small, understanding nod. Accountability begins with honesty. Thank you for choosing it now. Nearby, Emily Carter's tablet displayed a new message recognizing her for documenting conflicting information correctly and preserving the passenger record without alteration. She did not smile with satisfaction. Instead, she looked relieved that doing the right thing had ultimately mattered. Victor Reynolds turned toward the passengers with composed confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, a replacement flight crew has already been dispatched from the terminal. Your departure will proceed shortly. We sincerely appreciate your patience and apologize that you experienced this situation today." Several passengers quietly applauded, not because anyone had been embarrassed, but because they had witnessed an organization choosing transparency instead of excuses. Ethan Collins leaned back in his seat, reflecting on everything he had just seen. He realized the most remarkable person on the aircraft had never introduced herself, never demanded recognition, and never used her authority until every reasonable opportunity for fairness had already passed. That lesson stayed with him far more than the delay itself. A few minutes later, the replacement captain entered the cabin with measured confidence. Before saying anything else, she walked directly to Naomi. "Ms. Brooks, my name is Captain Laura Bennett. It is my privilege to welcome you aboard. On behalf of every professional who believes respect belongs to every passenger, I apologize for what occurred today." Naomi stood and shook her hand warmly. "Thank you, Captain Bennett. I appreciate your professionalism." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet it restored something that had been missing since boarding began: trust. Around the cabin, passengers settled back into their seats as the atmosphere slowly transformed from tension into quiet reflection. Flight attendants resumed preparing the cabin, but this time every interaction seemed more thoughtful than before. Emily greeted each traveler with genuine warmth, carefully making eye contact with every person she served. Linda gathered her belongings before leaving the aircraft, pausing briefly near seat 2 Alpha. Naomi offered one final courteous smile, and Linda returned it with grateful humility before stepping onto the jet bridge. As the aircraft door finally closed again, Michael Grant quietly informed Naomi that a full review had already been initiated and that every employee involved would receive a fair evaluation based on documented facts rather than assumptions. Naomi simply nodded. That was exactly how justice should work, not through anger or humiliation, but through truth, responsibility, and the willingness to learn. Outside, the jet bridge slowly pulled away from the aircraft. Inside, every person who had witnessed the events understood that the flight would continue, but many of them would leave carrying a lesson that would travel much farther than the airplane itself. As Flight 482 finally began pushing back from the gate, the cabin no longer felt like the same place where strangers had quietly judged one another less than an hour earlier. The engines came alive with their familiar steady rhythm, but inside first class another kind of momentum had taken hold. It was the quiet understanding that dignity could never be measured by clothing, appearances, or assumptions. Naomi Brooks looked out the window as the aircraft slowly turned toward the runway. Chicago's skyline stretched across the afternoon light, reminding her that every journey, whether personal or professional, was built one decision at a time. Rachel Morgan leaned slightly toward her. "The board has already scheduled an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They want to review every detail." Naomi smiled gently. "Good. Then let us make certain the lesson reaches further than this cabin." Rachel nodded. She understood exactly what Naomi meant. This was never about punishing individuals. It was about strengthening a culture. Across the aisle, Ethan Collins quietly opened the notes application on his phone. Before the aircraft even reached the runway, he typed a single sentence he hoped he would never forget. Respect should never depend on discovering someone's title. Emily Carter continued preparing the cabin with renewed confidence. As she offered beverages to each passenger, she treated every person with the same warmth, whether they wore a tailored business suit or a college sweatshirt. She realized that professionalism was not demonstrated when serving important people. It was demonstrated by treating everyone as though they were important. Captain Laura Bennett's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience today. We are number 2 for departure and expect a smooth flight to New York. We appreciate the opportunity to serve you. Several passengers smiled quietly at the simplicity of those words. Service was not complicated. It simply required consistency. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, sunlight poured through the windows, filling the cabin with a warm golden glow. Naomi watched the city slowly disappear beneath the clouds. She had built companies worth billions of dollars, negotiated international acquisitions, and spoken before thousands of business leaders. Yet she believed the smallest moments often revealed the greatest truths. A greeting, a glance, a choice to listen before judging. Those moments shaped organizations more than any financial report ever could. Michael Grant quietly closed the folder resting on his lap. The investigation will be thorough, he said. Naomi nodded. It should be. Fairness means evaluating facts, not emotions. She looked once around the cabin before returning her attention to the view outside. Many of the passengers smiled politely as their eyes met hers. None of them saw only a chief executive officer anymore. They saw a woman who had remained calm when she had every reason not to, who had answered disrespect with dignity, and who had allowed truth to speak louder than authority. Somewhere below, the airport continued welcoming new travelers who carried different stories, different backgrounds, and different dreams. Naomi hoped that the people responsible for greeting them would remember what had happened aboard Flight 482, because every stranger represented an opportunity. The next passenger might become a lifelong customer, a future colleague, a trusted friend, or the leader of the very company standing before them. But even if none of those things were true, every person deserved the same simple gift: to be seen first as a human being. As the airplane settled above the clouds, peace finally returned to the cabin. The journey continued toward New York, but for everyone who had witnessed that afternoon unfold, the destination no longer seemed like the most important part of the trip. The lesson they carried with them would travel much farther than the flight itself, reminding them that true leadership does not demand respect through power. It inspires respect by extending dignity before it is ever received.